historian and a San Francisco native.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy. Thank you. I want to thank you guys for coming out. Do I need this mic? I don't know. You can do it.
You might as well use it.
Yeah, I think I can do it. I want to thank you guys for coming today. Basically, I wrote this little book that I thought would be of interest to everyone, kind of a large audience, adult, as a general history book. And also just a kind of a cute little story that came my way. I'm from San Francisco, born and raised, and this story was introduced to me by a little famous person, my mom. My mom inspired me to write this book. My mom is born and raised in San Francisco, and she's something of I suppose, historian in her own right. She did a lot of reading and was constantly sending me stories of San Francisco and telling me about, well, first off, she made me interested in libraries. As a kid, we'd go to the library all the time. It got me interested in libraries, and something that I continue to do to this day. I've been visiting libraries. When I was in college, my first ambition was to become a history teacher. I wanted to come back and teach history to high school and junior high school and kind of introduce people to California history specifically. My mom kind of nurtured that and kind of provided kind of a basis for me to learn more about the city and also to do that. Of course, when I went to college, I started working in libraries my sophomore year. I said, hey, libraries are pretty cool. I think I'll keep working in libraries. I haven't stopped working in libraries since 1971. So what the lessons she taught me in appreciation of libraries has been forever. So, and her appreciation of history is why we have this Bummer book today. This is Bummer. It's a short book. It's not a hefty novel, but I wanted to do this book in a certain way that would be introduce, especially younger people, to history and the general public in kind of a light, not heavy academic approach to history. Kind of pique the interest of people who want to know a little about California history. My mom gave me this book. Now, she always gave me books. Mom is always good about giving books. One of the books she gave me was this book, kind of a nondescript book that sat on my shelf like forever. It's not a book that you would normally see. You would put it on the shelf and forget about it, right? Doesn't have a flashy jacket, and it's pretty hefty. It's called The Tales of San Francisco. And it's a really interesting book. It's got all kinds of short little stories about Lucky Baldwin, Black Bart, Jack London, all these different stories. And then here was a 10-story coverage of Bummer and Lazarus. And my mom would say, well, which ones did you read today? Well, I would say, well, I just read Bummer and Lazarus. It's really an interesting 10 pages about these dogs that were popular heroes in San Francisco in 1860. And I started reading that, and I said, well, what an interesting story. And we said, oh yeah, these guys met all these really important people in San Francisco at the time. Wouldn't it be interesting if only they could talk? What would these dogs say? What was their impression of these dogs? Meeting all these really important, famous San Francisco people back in 1860. So I started going on the internet and just said, well, what's out there? I would go through there and I'd find things like in SF Gate, which is the Chronicle, that they have the historic trails of the denizens, Bummer and Lazarus. And found SF as a digital archive of San Francisco history. And I found things like magazine articles, American Heritage, people who were talking about Bummer, kind of in a larger sense. And it was interesting to find out all the different, they were in tons of articles. If you ever Google Bummer and Lazarus, you'll find a million articles about Bummer and Lazarus. And even though I grew up in San Francisco myself, like my mom, born and raised in San Francisco, I had never heard of Bummer. I didn't know anything about it until that little 10-page thing's in the book. And but obviously, other people had heard of him and they had written about him. I decided, well, I had the general idea of who Bummer and Lazarus were. I said, well, I looked in the articles that were written, and I said, well, let me see what kind of look a little bit more about some of the characters that were involved in these articles that I found. And I said, well, there's a Wikipedia. I said, well, let's get encyclopedia articles. So I went to the Wikipedia, found Bummer and Lazarus, Frederick Lander, who I'll talk about later, and Emperor Norton, important people who were a part of the Bummer and Lazarus story and a part of the San Francisco history story of 1860. 1860 was kind of an interesting time in San Francisco history. Of course, the 49ers had already been there since 49, 48, when they were kind of in that developing era of San Francisco history. But kind of post 1949, 1860 was a time that the rush was over, but now what type thing? The city was still kind of growing, but the rush had gone to the foothills, but now things were settling a little bit. People were still coming in droves, but they were still kind of feeling their way around San Francisco. It was quite a time to be in San Francisco. A lot of things were going on. I decided one of the other most important things to do was to find out which articles were written in contemporary history. And I knew of a database, and I don't know if any of you have used this database before, but if you have not used this database before, Douglas, my colleague here, has spearheaded the library's efforts in providing access to electronic resources, and specifically in the archive of Redondo Beach history. Electronic resources, a lot of different things, magazines, newspapers, driving tests. If you haven't gone on there, go to our website, click on electronic resources. You'll see all kinds of different things you have. The American Archive of Public Broadcasting, Archive of Redondo Beach history, archives of sexuality and gender, et cetera, et cetera. It's an alphabetical list. And I will highlight the Archive of Redondo Beach history real quick. If you have not tried that database before, please look at it. We have anybody here from Redondo Union High School? Yeah, a few of you, right? If you have not seen this before, if you want to look at your old high school yearbook, we have Douglas and Virginia have scanned all of the art yearbooks going back to 1905 or so. Was that first yearbook, Therese? 1915. That's my wife, by the way. She's the official archivist of the high school. She has helped with every single yearbook of the high school has been scanned, and you can look up your sisters, your mothers, whatever, or if they went to Redondo, you can find their picture in there. A lot of great stuff. Also great postcard collections, all kinds of good things that are available for you to look at on our archive of Redondo Beach history, okay? I just want to point that out because it's a great resource, and please try and use our electronic resources if you get a chance. Inside there, again, the list on that electronic resource is alphabetical, so if you go to N for newspapers, you'll find something called the California Digital Newspaper Collection, CDNC. It looks like, does it come from Riverside? UC Riverside, is that who sponsors that? And I looked at this UCR, this California Digital Newspaper Collection, and I said, well, what kind of articles were written contemporaneous to the event of Bummer and Lazarus? And I found out by putting in Bummer and Dog, there's like a gazillion articles written about Bummer and Dog. I said, well, that's way too much, because I was finding a dog named Bummer who lived in San Jose, one that lived down here and there. I said, well, I better narrow down that search by adding Bummer, Dog, San Francisco. When I did a search in that database, I found almost 2,000 articles written about a dog named Bummer that was in San Francisco. And these are articles that were written contemporaneously with when Bummer was around. The first one that comes up is Bummer and Lazarus, two amiable friends, okay? Written in something called a Placer County up in the foothills of the Low Country there. In 1892, had written an article about Bummer and Lazarus. Second article is Bummer and Lazarus in the Park Museum. An article written in San Francisco Call, which was a famous newspaper in San Francisco, in February 1906, 2 months before the book. Thank you. Can you hear me better? Let me use this one. Is that better? Can you hear me? Anyway, Bummer and Lazarus, in 1906, it's 2 months before the earthquake of 1906 is when this article was written. I want to point out that article especially because I had a choice when I was writing my book, and it involves the Bummer and Lazarus in the Park Museum. Okay, again, these dogs were in 1906, or 1860. This article's 1906. So people were writing about these guys forever in San Francisco Press. The next article is written in the Santa Barbara Weekly Press called Bummer, an article in 1875.
I could go on and on about all these articles that were written about the history of these dogs who I had never heard of, but apparently the rest of the San Francisco area had heard of way back in 1875 and 1892. Over 2,000 articles. I had a lot of articles that I could read. Many of the articles kind of replicated each other. They were all about kind of the same things, but every now and then I'd get a kernel of information that was just a little bit different or I had not heard of. I also found another resource I went to was the San Francisco Public Library, SFPL, and I said, well, let's see what I can find out from the San Francisco website, and I found some great things in their digital collection. And again, as I was gathering resources and information about BUMMER, wow, what can I find? Well, I found 15 articles about our friend Emperor Norton, who we'll talk about in a little bit. Emperor Norton was quite a character, and you'll see pictures of him from the San Francisco Public Library. And I also just typed in the term, the date of 1860. What does the San Francisco Public Library have in their digital photo collection about 1860 San Francisco? And I found there were 296 pictures of San Francisco in 1860. I kind of point this out only in that as you're kind of lazing around on the internet and trying to find something interesting, consider the library websites as a way to find kind of great stuff that's been preserved and for you to share and read and learn more about the history, our history, the San Francisco's history, and California's history. So I had all this information. I said, well, what am I going to do with all this stuff? I want to write. My mom had actually suggested, why don't you write a little story about how, what it would be like if these dogs could talk? And that's how I was gathering all this stuff. But what was I going to do with this? I was going to write a story, but I wanted to keep it light. I didn't want a heavy history book. I wanted a light read that people could kind of dip into California history without being over academic, make it a friendly read, a short read. And especially I was thinking, who else reads dog books? Mostly a lot of dog books are read by oftentimes young people, young adults. They get the Old Yellers, the Black Beauties, the Charlotte's Web. Those are the type. And I said, well, we want to make sure that I want to make a book that would be interesting for younger people, the young YA audience, young adult audience, as well as general people who just want to know about California history without being bogged down by academics. So I said, I'll take a light read. Hopefully it'll be of interest that will get people to read more about history. And then they'll be able to look at some of these resources maybe and delve more into this. So I said, well, there were two different ways I could approach this. Now, one of the ways I was going to approach this was that article about the museum. BUMMER and Lazarus were actually, they visited, a taxidermist took charge of them when they met their demise. And they were, for a long time, were on display in the museum. I could have taken the approach of making my story come from the vantage point of kind of a Citizen Kane, Rosebud type thing, but it was kind of depressing. I go, no, I don't want to do that because it was not a kind of a positive outlook to the story. I would rather have it be reflective of an old dog, because he was an old dog by the time the story ends. He was an older dog who would sit at the end of a pier and just look out at the bay waters, listening to the waters as they lapped up against the piers, and that would how he would be reflecting on his life and what had gone on in his life. So I kind of came up with that theme. That was the way I was going to write this book, this little short story of BUMMER. So I had this, this kind of became a family project of sorts. The illustrations, I had the photos, by the way, approved by the city archivist. San Francisco city archivist works for the public library. And she granted me permission to use the photos. All of the photos that you see in the BUMMER book are from the San Francisco Public Library, and I was granted permission from the archivist to use them for the book. She also included the book in the San Francisco Public Library reference collection. So BUMMER's a big hero in San Francisco now, or at least for me she is. But I took this theory of just kind of this dog reflecting on his life, and I said, well, I'm not an illustrator. I don't know what kind of cover could I use. My niece, she's 17. She was a junior in high school. She's now graduated. She just graduated this June, on her way to culinary school now. But I asked her, could she design something? She's something of an artist. She said, well, I'll do something. And together she put down this cover for me. So this cover came from my niece. It became a family project, again, for my mom. We did this for my mom, so she could have a book. So I gathered all these things, and I had great illustrations. I had help from my niece and the illustrations here. And I sent out some query letters to publishers, to agents. How can I get this book published? I just want a little quick thing. Of course, I've got a pile of rejection letters just about this big right now. I said, you know what? I'm doing this for my mom, but you know what? My mom is now 92. She's now 94 now, but she's 92 at the time I'm doing this. And I go, what am I going to do? The pandemic had happened. I had all this stuff. What am I going to do? I can't find it. They weren't publishing anything. So I said, I need this thing published. I can't wait for a publisher or a press agent or publicist to help me get this happen. So I said, what am I going to do? How am I going to make this book happen? So I went to my friendly technical assistant, Lori Palaio. Now you're saying, oh, Lori, you know Lori. Lori worked with me at El Camino College. She happened to be one of my colleagues. I had known her since I got to El Camino College 100 years ago. She was with me in the library. I would have had her here. Her daughter is the current American Library Association president, and she is currently in Chicago, where her daughter is presiding over the convention there of the American Library Association. So Lori was a great colleague, but I knew one thing about Lori, is Lori had self-published a series of books, which I have here on the desk here. These are the books here that she said if anybody would like to buy one of her books. Something about her, I got to ask something about her. She's into murder, apparently. I got to talk really nicely to her. She wrote a case study in murder, an edition of murder, old-fashioned murder, commitment to murder, reunion and murder. I think there's a theme here. And I think she would murder me if I didn't tell you more about her fabulous books. No, but if you're interested in her books, they are here for $15. They're available for sale. And she's got a list here of the other books that she's written. Lori is a great colleague. I would say, Lori, can you help me put my book together? I've got it written in text in Microsoft Word. I've inserted photos that I have gathered from my nieces. I have, and also from the San Francisco Public Library. Can you help me put the book together? Well, a couple of trips to Captain Kidd's, fish tacos, and a couple of beverages. I had the book done. She goes, fine, we'll get it on its way. She helped me make the book, and I can't thank Lori enough for that. So on we go to Bummer. Who is Bummer? Let's talk about Bummer now. That's enough about the book and how it came to be in physical form. But who was Bummer? Well, this is another illustration of another one of my nieces. This is Bernadette Swarties. That's my niece. She also helped provide a little interest to this book, or make this book happen for me, by providing this artwork. This was her portrayal of Bummer. And who was Bummer? Who was Bummer? Well, Bummer was a dog born in San Francisco, kind of a stray dog, really, but he had a temporary owner when he was first in San Francisco. In the late 1850s, he hooked up this adventurer that owned Bummer for a little bit. I don't know who this owner was, but he was an adventurer of sorts. And he joined with General Frederick Lander, very famous person. Now, how many people have heard of Lander before? Right, I had never heard of him either. Never heard of the guy. He was one of the foremost trailblazers in American history. He helped to provide wagon routes and kind of lay the groundwork for railroads in the West. Now, he was a really dapper guy. He was such a stud. This guy was amazing. He was a Renaissance man par excellence. He was a poet, a civil engineer, a military man. He could do it all. He was a really dapper man who had something called, what they call indescribable magnetism. So he was quite the man. He went there and laid the groundwork for these railroads in the West, primarily Wyoming, Idaho. He did the Wyoming to Oregon Trail, and also something called the Lander Trail, which was a trail from Wyoming Territory to California. Now, he spent a lot of time in San Francisco at the time, and Lander was quite the man. He had a lot of adventures just in and of himself. Now, along the route, what Bummer's job was to go on this trail, and this is an actual trail picture of the wagons as they were going there. Of course, in this wagon train, if you will, were surveyors, engineers, manual laborers, all who were there to lay the trail who made California what it was. They were very important in California history, and Bummer was along for the ride. He mainly provided companionship, but he also had a vital job of chasing away varmints, especially around the cook's wagon there, where when he was cooking the food, animals would come up there and he would chase them away. He had something of a job there, but mainly just chasing things around and being a good companion. That was his main job. So, but he was an important part of California history just in that. Along the way, one of the things that Bummer discovers in his travels is that sometimes people are mean. People weren't always nice to Bummer. So Bummer had some interesting things. And one of the things he ran across, and in fact Lander himself had run across many times, there were dozens of tribes, Native American tribes in California and the West. And a lot of times there were hostilities and things went through. Lander was very persuasive, and with his magnetism was able to swap horses for good passage and made good friends with as many of the local tribes as possible. Didn't always work out, but sometimes Bummer would hear stories from some of the workers on the trail who would tell him, "Did you hear about what happened to these Indians here?" And he heard a story about the Pomo tribe in Norton Clear Lake, which is about 50 miles north of San Francisco, who were basically massacred in a very sad. Now he didn't hear all the details of the massacre. He just heard a bad massacre had happened. But basically it had involved a couple of settlers who were using the native tribes for slaves. And basically the slaves revolted and took care of the two people who were making them slaves. The military responded by coming and wiping out the Pomo tribe. Okay. Depending on which article you read, either anywhere from 60 to 400 tribes members were killed, depending on the count, and mainly women and children. So, I'm sorry, Ron, yeah.
Can you put this in a time context? Was this,
yeah, well,
was
the
this
Pomo
before
tribe
the
was
Civil
about,
War or after?
the Pomo, good question. The Pomo tribe, because he had heard this along the route, this had happened some 10, 20 years before Bummer was there. It was about 1840, I think. Might have been 1850. I think it was 1850 actually. Somewhere in the 50s. So it was before Bummer was there. Bummer was there in around 1860. Because Lander, by 1860, had married this really famous actress, one of the great actresses of United States history in 1850, was this woman named Davenport, Jean Margaret Davenport, famous actress. She had gone across the country as a famous celebrity in her own right. And he had married her in 1860 San Francisco. And he was only, Lander, I'll just kind of go a little bit more on Lander. He was in San Francisco often, but he, after he had gone on a couple of these trails in 1861, Civil War happened. He went back east to help, and the South, to help with the war effort. Lander himself actually dies in 1862. He had been wounded in the Civil War, and ultimately dies of pneumonia in West Virginia, or Virginia. So that was Lander's story, but all of this is preceding, even the adventure up there is the early 1860s, late 1850s. That's when Bummer is with the Lander Trail. And that's where he's hearing of the stories of the Pomo tribe and them being wiped out years before Bummer was there. But he had heard of meanness, and the meanness on the trail. When he comes back from Lander's trail, after doing all that adventures in the trailblazing with Lander, he comes back to Sacramento, actually, is where he ends up, with this owner, this adventurer who took him there. And the adventurer says, "You know what, I'm tired of having this dog with me. I don't want this dog anymore." He doesn't have a name. He doesn't have a name Bummer yet, by the way. He just has he's just a dog. I think they called him Hey You. I don't know what they called him. I really don't know. I made the Hey You up. I don't know. He must have had a name, but that's not of importance now. But anyway, this owner says, you know, he starts trying to sell off this dog. He send him to anybody who would take him. He finds this one guy called the Captain. The Captain has a ranch in this place called Petaluma. Again, maybe 20 miles north of San Francisco or so. Petaluma, mainly famous for chicken ranches, by the way. If you've ever been to Petaluma, that's what really they're famous for. But they also had some sheep that were there, and the Captain had a lot of sheep and cattle on his property. And this guy, this adventurer said, hey, Captain, you'll love this dog. He'll be great. He's a great family dog. He can be a shepherd for you. You can do whatever you want him to do, he'll do it. Well, he took the dog to Petaluma, and he had a great job as a sheepdog for about less than 1 day, okay? And he had one overnight experience as a sheepdog. He didn't do so well as a sheepdog in Petaluma. Our poor dog friend was immediately, after his 1 day where he did the poor job of herding these sheep, he didn't understand the concept of being a shepherd or a sheepdog. So after his one dog experience as a shepherd, he was shipped back up to Sacramento, where he eventually meets this newspaper man named Ned Knight. Ned Knight, not Ted Knight from the old TV shows, but Ned Knight. Ned Knight was a San Francisco, they called him, in one of the articles I read, I think it was an 1890 article, I think it was talking about Ned Knight, they called him a paragrapher. I had never heard the word paragrapher in my life, but that's what the newspaper articles described him as, a paragrapher. Basically, he was a reporter, okay? He was a reporter for one of the San Francisco papers, and he mainly settled in a place on Montgomery Street. And the question is, you don't know, people had said they don't know San Francisco. Montgomery Street, if you've seen the Trans-America building in San Francisco, that's Montgomery Street. That's basically where Bummer He used to hang out. He used to hang around in that area near the Trans-America building, that to kind of give yourself. He used to go to this place, the first place that Ned used to take him was a bar called Martin's Saloon, owned by Frederick Martin. And Frederick Martin's saloon was famous for newspaper men. All the newspaper men from San Francisco, early journalists, newspaper reporters, would go to the saloon, Martin's Saloon. They would hang out there. And that night was really good. And Bummer, this is where Bummer gets his name, by the way. Because one of the things that Bummer learns along the route here is that if you go in, when he went in with Ned, he would go there and he'd kind of be cuddling. He'd go to the table and he'd just curl up underneath the table where the folks were eating, and he just kind of looked. And he would notice people would just stop dropping food at him. He'd say, hey, this is pretty cool. I can just kind of look. And these people would feed him. And he started to become a bummer. They said, oh, here he is, he's bumming more food, he's bumming more food. And they would walk to him and say, you're bumming. And they would make fun of him, but he was part of the group. He was part of the newspaper group. He was a bummer, but he was a good bummer in that that's how they respected him, or they liked him as a pet. He was a pet for everyone. All the newsmen loved him because he was part of the group. Now, one of the things that they do discover is that Bummer is really good at one thing. He earned his way around those restaurants because he became what I call the king ratter. San Francisco at the time, as with most wharf towns, by the way, has problems with vermin, with rats, with mice that come and try and eat all the goods there, especially right off the things coming right off the pier. Who knows what was coming off those piers in barrels of goods and things. A lot of vermin. Well, the restaurants, of course, near the area were having a horrible time with rats and mice and vermin. And they discovered that, hey, now this is something I can do. I can help you take care of that problem with your mice, your vermin. I can chase them away. I'm really good at this. And he would go into restaurants, especially starting at Martin's, and later discovering other restaurants, and chase the vermin out. He was really good at it. He would scare all the mice and rats out of these restaurants. He became a hero. Of course, by this time he and Ned Knight. Ned Knight, by the way, was called an avant-garde. That was how he was described in the newspapers. He was an avant-garde writer, journalist, paragrapher. Well, you know what? Bummer got tired of being with this avant-garde person, or maybe vice versa. The avant-garde Ned got tired of Bummer. Regardless, Bummer started kind of going off on his own. He now had a label. He had a name, Bummer. He could go into any restaurant he wanted, beg for food, and earn his way around by chasing rats. He became so good at this that newspapermen started writing about him and his skills at doing this. And they were writing, the newspapers of San Francisco in the 1860s were filled with articles about Bummer. And he could go to any restaurant in San Francisco, and they would, come on, Bummer, come on in. They would not only did he have to go like this for food, they would invite him to go into their larders, to go into their restaurants, come and chase away all those rats. One of the few, you don't see dogs going into restaurants these days doing that, but Bummer was afforded that. So he was the chief. He was the king ratter. He could go up and down Montgomery Street, again where the Transamerica building is. He could go up and down Montgomery Street, and any other restaurants he wanted. He was the king. He was treated like royalty, and he would parade around as such. Well, at one point he meets up. He goes on these constitutional walks after going to Martin's. Okay, he had a full dinner and he's walking out with a full belly, and he notices a big commotion down the street. He goes, "What in the world's going on?" It was a big pack of dogs, vicious dogs, and they surrounded this little scrawny little dog, and they were biting and nipping at this dog and causing a big ruckus. And he goes, "Oh my gosh, I'm not going to let that happen. I'm going to save that little dog. I'm going to take care of this dog." He jumped right into this pack of mean, vicious dogs, bit away at them, and got the big leader of the pack, bit the side of that dog. All those dogs ran away. He saved the life of this scrawny little dog. And he took that dog, and it was just a mangled pile of nothing, and brought him to this doorstep. Because at this point, Bummer was sleeping on doorsteps, right? He would just curl up every night. He had a certain doorstep he would hang around every night, because he was not owned by anyone at this point. And he brought this little dog to his doorstep, and he put him, he always did it the same way. Newspaper writers would say the same thing. They would always put him against the door, and he would curl up on the outside to protect this little dog from any danger, and he kind of nursed him back to health. And he was a good nurse. Bummer was a really great nurse. What he would do is he would continue his bumming circle. He would go to these restaurants, but newspapermen start saying, "Wow, this is interesting. He's not just eating the food there, he's taking it with him. What is he doing with this food that he's not eating in the restaurants with us?" He was taking the food from the restaurants and bringing them to his friend who was curled up in the corner. And he would do this for days and days, weeks and weeks, until this dog suddenly came back to life. This dog that they thought was dead, newspaper men had already written him off. He came back to life. The newspaper men said, "Wow, it's just like Lazarus." And that's how Lazarus got his name. Lazarus became rising from the dead. Bummer had brought him back to life. So the two of these dogs became heroes of their own right. They became paraders. They would go cruising down the streets of San Francisco. They were the heroes. Bummer, of course, but Lazarus right by his side. And they would parade. They were famous for parading. And people in San Francisco writing stories and stories about Bummer and Lazarus, these two heroes, parading around the streets. They would go up to Kearny Street. They would go anywhere they wanted there. You see the boardwalks, which were literally walks made out of boards, and they would walk up and down the streets there, and they would go into any restaurant they wanted. Well, one day, and this is Market Street. If you know San Francisco, you know Market Street, right? The main drag. This is Market Street. I think this one says a Market Street restaurant. This is Market Street back in 1860. But one day they were parading around the streets of San Francisco, and they heard a loud crash, boom. And in this crash, it was part of a construction thing. A wall had fallen down above this fruit market, and hundreds and hundreds of rats came running out of this construction site. What were these people? The panic, San Francisco, the panic. There were hundreds of people in San Francisco, more, they all ran like crazy. It was bedlam. All of a sudden, people were running like crazy because of this avalanche of rats and mice were crawling out of these spaces. Well, Bummer and Lazarus happened to be in the area, and Bummer and Lazarus came to the rescue. It was said that, and newspaper journalists love this story. This is what brought them their fame. When that building went down, one report said there were 80 rats killed in 20 minutes. Another one said over 400 mice were killed that day. It was a big story. It made all the press. They were the heroes of San Francisco. You talk about going anywhere you wanted in the city. Restaurateurs, merchants, they were applauded, they clapped. They made these two dogs the big time heroes of San Francisco. And they could go anywhere they wanted in this city. They were the bee's knees, if you will. Or what did I say? I think they put the wow in bow wow. Is that what I said? Okay. Now, one of the things that they do along the story here is they also meet a lot of interesting people. Now, one of the people they meet is this construction worker from China. Now, San Francisco, as you may or may not know, or you probably know there's a big Chinatown, but what about the people from China that were brought in as immigrants? They did a lot of the construction of the city in the early 1860s, late 1850s. A lot of the Victorians, a lot of those houses, a lot of the architecture, all done from the hard labor of the Chinese immigrants. Well, one of the, in the story that I created here, they meet this gentleman from this Chinese carpenter, and they notice that he all of a sudden is assaulted. For no reason at all, he's just reading a newspaper. He gets assaulted by these two people who didn't quite make it in the gold mines. They came, because there were a lot of people like that who didn't make it in the mines, came back to the city, and basically were mean. Okay, so they beat up this guy, this carpenter they liked, and they didn't like it. But they chased after, and they didn't catch the guy. But then a police officer came, but he wasn't fast enough to catch this guy who beat up this carpenter. And but they knew who it was. But they later on, they see the friends of the man from China take him to Chinatown, where he's comforted. And then the next couple of days, the Bummer and Lazarus are kind of roaming the streets. They see the officer there, and they see the officers trying to arrest that man who had beat up this carpenter. But the guy wasn't taking it kindly, to being arrested. So he started fighting the officer. Well, Bummer and Lazarus become heroes once again by chasing and biting and nipping at this guy who had beat up their friend and was also trying to assault the officer. They became police dogs that day. They helped apprehend that dog, that mean man. They became heroes once again by saving this officer and saving the person by arresting that guy who beat up their friend. So they became police dogs for one day. Now, this is an important day in San Francisco history. Not one day, but one type of event. Steamer Day in San Francisco. I love this picture. I love this illustrator, Edward Jump. You're going to run across, we're going to talk about him as much as I can in the next little bit here. Steamer Day. As you can imagine, San Francisco in 1860s had a lot of energy. Every time a ship came in, people had a long, arduous journey. The ways to get to San Francisco back in 1860, you could come by Cape Horn, all the way on this long journey around South America, up to San Francisco, or you could go to Panama, take a boat from like New York or Boston into Panama, get off there, take a trek across the Panama, get back on another boat, and come up to San Francisco. Those were the two primary ways they got to San Francisco. There weren't that many ways across. Lander hadn't made enough wagon routes across the country, and there weren't transcontinental railroads yet. That didn't happen until 1869 or so. It was a while before the transcontinental railroad was complete. So there was really a hard, arduous journey. When the steamers came in, you don't know how relieved those people were to get to San Francisco. And they would get off the boat, and some of them would be all dapper, some would be more informally dressed. All of them were tired and glad to be in San Francisco, to arrive. And hip, hip, hooray, here they come in their wagons, and you look at all these top hat guys and fancy guys, and really big things were going on. But one of the things you'll see in these adventures that were going on these days, there's a dog here, there's a dog there. Dogs were something of a problem at this point. There was more dogs in San Francisco than people, they were saying. Wild dogs were all over the place in the early 1860s. There were almost more dogs than people, although you can't tell it from here. But they are illustrated in this picture by Edward Jump, in this sketch by Edward Jump. There were so many dogs that the 1862 San Francisco passed something called the dog laws, or the leash laws, where if every dog was not on a leash or with their owner, they were captured, and they were shipped out. And well, you know what happens to dogs if they're not taken care of. They were taken by the agency and hauled off and probably never seen again. Well, this was a sad event for these hero dogs. San Francisco, Love Bummer and Lazarus, this can't apply to them. They don't have owners. They don't have leashes. But unfortunately, Laz was captured by the dog catcher, brand new on the job. Bummer got away, but Lazarus was captured. and he was lassoed and put in the back of that thing and hauled off. The city merchants had a fit. They all protested this like crazy. They went to City Hall. What do you mean this leash law? You can't have this leash law. That can't apply to our hero dogs, can it? Well, you know, they got their way. The city hall said, you know what, we'll give a reprieve and we'll review this again with regards to BUMMER and Lazarus. We're still gonna have leash laws, but the city hall, the board of supervisors, will examine how we're gonna treat these two dog heroes. So they have a day in court, if you will, and one of the people from Martin's takes BUMMER and Lazarus over to the City Hall where this board of supervisors is meeting, and they said, okay, and they said, just sit there outside the courtroom, we're gonna be talking about you. And they curled there, again, that mournful look that BUMMER could do, just waiting there. They somehow knew what was going on in that room there. They somehow sensed what the conversation must have been about them. They didn't really know, but they thought they did. So the merchants went in there and said, well, I can't do this or that. And the board said, well, we have laws around here. They went argue. But the end result of this was they were granted permission, thanks to the merchants, the people in Martin's bar, and all the other people who had such an uproar over trying to put a leash on these two dogs, that these two dogs, and only these two dogs, in the city of San Francisco, were granted the permission of not having a leash, not having an owner. They could go anywhere they wanted because they were considered employees of the city. So they could do whatever they wanted. They were given a reprieve, and that's a really, really great thing for them. They were no longer under that. Edward Jump. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Edward Jump. He had a roommate. Can you guess who his roommate was for a short while? You'll never know. Mark Twain. Mark Twain, for a brief while, was in San Francisco, okay? Now, Mark Twain features largely in the BUMMER story, okay? Mark Twain, he and his brother had come from, of course, from the Mississippi area, where we all know the Mark Twain story, but he had gone over to Nevada, what was called Washoe County, or Washoe, okay, and which is now called Nevada, okay? And he had become, trying to make his way in the silver mines as a silver miner. He didn't do so well as that, but one of the things he did find out is that he could write to keep him, he didn't make money as a silver miner. He did buy some silver stock and became rich in the silver market in that regard, but he did not make it much as an actual silver miner. But he found the way he could supplement his fees, his income, was by writing as a reporter for a relatively liberal press, okay? And I'll just say he could write, not heavy reporting, but kind of creative writing. How's that? There was a more loosely formed newspaper up in Washoe in Nevada. So he came up there and he was doing that writing for a little bit. Eventually he comes down to San Francisco. He says, I'm gonna try and find my way in San Francisco. Go to this place called the Bank Exchange, which for the life of me, I don't understand why it's called the Bank Exchange, but the Bank Exchange was a bar. It was a saloon. And it was, you know, BUMMER spent a lot of time in saloons. I have no idea why, but he did meet Mr. Mark Twain and Edward Jump. They meet, BUMMER and Lazarus meet Edward Jump and Mark Twain in the Bank Exchange. Bank Exchange was this is an actual place, and they would go in there. That was where the Bank Exchange was. A very famous saloon in San Francisco in the 1860s. And they served something called Pisco Punch. Now, Pisco Punch literally delivered a punch. It was a punch that was made out of brandy from Peru, and it was powerful. And this is the recipe. You can make this yourself. Cloves, Pisco, brandy, some pineapple juice, orange juice, and lemon juice. Stir it all together, put some ice and a lemon on there, and or a lime or pineapple, it looks like, and away you go. You got yourself a potent drink. This was a very vicious drink, however. It was a wild drink, but the only place that served it in San Francisco was the Bank Exchange. It became very famous in San Francisco. Pisco Punch. We won't focus on that too much, but I'll just say there were a few punches thrown over Pisco Punch, as you can imagine, in any bars in 1860 San Francisco. Well, Bummer and Lazarus, again, spending a lot of time. I'm trying to keep this to 1 hour, but I'm sorry if I speak a little bit longer than I need, but I'm going to keep going here. One of the other saloons they go to is located near something called Meg's Wharf. In 1865, it's important to point this year out. This is a picture of Meg's Wharf in 1865. I want you to see how few ships are out there. I'll tell you why later on, as I go on. But Meg's Wharf was kind of North Beach. You've all heard of North Beach, San Francisco. To kind of orient yourself as to what's where. This is North Beach here. This is all became North Beach, San Francisco. Again, the Montgomery Street would be around here somewhere. But over here, right around in there somewhere at the foot of it, was one of the most famous saloons of San Francisco. It was called the Cobweb Palace. The Cobweb Palace. Fantastic bar. I wish they had it today. I don't drink much, but if I did, I'd get my Pisco Punch here. Fabulous place, very unusual kind of bar. Old Abe Warner was a dapper guy. He had a top hat and he was always dressed so dignified. And you can't really, it's kind of a blurred out picture here. But the Cobweb Palace was interesting. Old Abe had a superstition about spiders. He had the thing where he said, you shouldn't kill a spider. It's bad luck to kill a spider. Let the spiders live. As a result, his saloon was covered with cobwebs everywhere you went. But it's not just that. The Cobweb Palace, and this is the interior, was filled with all kinds of, and there's the cobwebs, all kinds of artwork everywhere. And if you look very carefully in some of these shots here, you'll find cages. He had a lot of wild animals. He had coyotes, bears, snakes, you name it, whatever could be put in a cage or roam free in the bar was given full access. You could go anywhere you wanted. So you didn't know when you went in there who you were going to be sharing that beverage with. It could have been a coyote, I don't know. But a lot of them were caged, but not all of them. Some of them were roaming around there. But it was really popular. One of the things old Abe had at the Cobweb Palace was clam chowder, and he would invite you, come on in for some free clam chowder. Clam chowder is free. Come on in, share some time with my animals, and buy an expensive beer, I guess. But he made his money. Cobweb Palace, he'd get right off the boat and say, let's get over to the Cobweb Palace. One of the, and you can see the cages here. There's a couple of cages here. There's a cage there. I'm sure there's others there. There's old Abe there. And one of the famous ones was the parrot. The parrot was called Warner Grandfather. And he was one of the popular ones. And imagine with all the pirates and sailors in that area, the language that parrot could say back to you, some of it would not be appropriate for children. But old Abe was famous, the grandfather. I have the little in my story, old Lazarus is barking up to him and they bark back at each other. And this was just a favorite haunt of theirs. They loved going to this bar. And who wouldn't? It was such a wild place. Even when you went into the Cobweb Palace, they had monkeys at the entrance. So as you went in there, even before you entered, you were met by monkeys, little chimps there, little guys down there, and there's some cages there. And they had a guy out there selling peanuts. So you come, when you went in there, buy some peanuts and go inside and get some clam chowder. The Cobweb Palace, really fascinating bar. That was part of their life. Now, the other thing, I talked in that early picture of Meg's Wharf. There's only a couple of boats out there in the water. Well, way back in early 1860s, late 1850s, San Francisco was flooded with all those abandoned ships that were all over the bay. Hundreds of ships that were sitting in the middle of San Francisco Bay. What was happening is all these people were coming up around Cape Horn, coming up across from Panama. They would get off the ships, all these crews would get off the ship. The first thing they would do when they got off the ship, they'd head on to Sutter's Mill. They'd head off to the hills looking for gold, silver. They didn't want to be on that boat anymore. They were done with it. So all of a sudden, all of these captains with these boats that had taken their crews and had to take their crews back to the east or go to Hawaii or China, wherever they were shipping, they were stuck. These boats were stuck. They needed to get their cargo back in the water, but the crews were gone. They had no crews. Well, one of the things that Bummer and Lazarus experienced, they find out a story, a very bad story, something from the Barbary Coast. If you know the San Francisco at all, Barbary Coast in San Francisco, it's kind of a mean place in San Francisco. Okay, it's a lot of strange things happen in the Barbary Coast. A lot of, Dick Dodd had sung a song one time from the Standells back, talking about the Boston Harbor, about lovers, muggers, and thieves. Well, Barbary Coast was filled with lovers, muggers, and thieves. A lot of bad people lived in the Barbary Coast. And one of the things the Barbary Coast had was people who would Shanghai people. The way that these captains were able to get crews to get on these ships, to bring them back and keep their boats out of the water and get them back to China or Boston, is they would Shanghai people. And one of the things that Bummer and Laz run across is they run across a bar, especially Ms. Pogo, and I won't go into that so much, but they would witness one of these Shanghai events, okay? And it wasn't a pleasant experience. Basically, they would have a way a crimp would bring someone in for a friendly drink, and the next thing they knew, the drink was either had some special spice, maybe Pisco punch, I don't know what. They would end up bopped on the head. Next thing they knew, they woke up, they were on a boat in the middle of the ocean on the way to Shanghai. Okay, Bummer and Lazarus recognize that, and they do visit a bar that has that. One other person they met, however, in the bar, not so evil as the people who were Shanghai people, but was this person named Emperor Norton. Emperor Norton, if you know anything about San Francisco history, he is the number 1 character in San Francisco history, 1860 San Francisco history. Emperor Norton, really famous guy. Born in London, raised in South Africa, comes over to try and make his way as in fame and fortune in San Francisco in 1849. He dresses just like an emperor because he was something of an emperor. He made a fortune, not by, when he came there in 1849, didn't go to the mines, didn't try to do that. He bought a bunch of lots in San Francisco, a lot of property, put a lot of buildings in there, made a ton of money. He was so rich, they said everything he touched turned to gold. He was most popular, most wealthy resident of San Francisco. He made one tragic mistake, and he invested all his money in the rice trade, lost it all. He went from living in a really famous big house to living in a boarding house. But people kind of felt sorry for the guy. He kind of went crazy for a little bit. And he was still acting as an emperor. He created his own money. He called himself, "I am now the Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico," he would tell everybody. And he would go anywhere he wanted in the city, and he made his own money, his own currency, and he would go in there and he'd say, "I'd like this and that." People would give him stuff. He would just do whatever they wanted. They would let him do it. He was quite a character. He had this crazy idea. In fact, he would go to bars and say, "You wouldn't believe, I'm thinking, you could build a bridge to the other side in a tunnel that would go from this side of the bay to the other." Ha ha ha, never happened, they said to him. He was right. He may have been crazy, but as crazy as he was right on target. There was obviously a bridge and a tunnel now, but back in 1860, they laughed him out of the bar. Our friend Edward Jump, he loved it. He would portray the two of them, because Laz and Bum started to hang around this character. The three of them worked together and walk around the city as the big heroes of the city, and they could go anywhere. Again, the press was writing about, first they were just writing about him parading around Bummer. Then they were writing articles about Bummer and Laz walking around together. Now the newspaper guys could write about the three of them walking around the streets of San Francisco. The three of them, the three Bummers, going around eating food whenever and wherever they wanted. Again, Edward Jump wrote this, had this one, here's our Emperor Norton, and there's our Bummer and Laz. They were parading around the streets of San Francisco. Now sadness comes into the life of Bummer when all of the parading that they have done and there's more experiences that Bummer and Lazarus had together. But unfortunately, Bummer's friend Lazarus has a sad story. He's poisoned, unfortunately. And it's a very sad event, and Bummer is so disconsolate. Look how sad it is, very sad. Saddest day, it's called the saddest day in this poor dog's life. His good friend, his buddy, his dog mate, if you will, his soulmate, had died. He was poisoned. And so Edward Jump showed this little sketch here. Here's Emperor Norton acting as the Pope, as it were, giving out the last rites to the dog here. And I see all of these characters here, and all of these these are all famous people in San Francisco history of 1860. I love this illustration. It means so much as far as the history of San Francisco, in that you get the characters. And I did read one thing where it names some of these people, but suffice to say, it was an interesting thing. Edward Young captured the funeral. They said hundreds of people came to the funeral of Lazarus, the dog. As I can digress just a little bit from my BUMMER speech, this picture reminded me of one thing. Reminded me of this picture. Another picture where some dudes in uniform are presiding over a funeral with hundreds of people looking down at the ceremony. A digression from BUMMER, but I just thought it was an interesting little footnote, similar to the Edward Young picture. One other thing I noticed, who is this character here? If that's not Beavis, I don't know who is. And also, I got one other one. There's this dude here, which is shown there. If that's not Einstein, I don't know who is. Well, I don't know where this guy came from. Anyway, I just thought it was an interesting picture. Has nothing to do with BUMMER. I just throw that in. One of the other things that my mom gave me, again, she was good on giving me books. She gave me this book on San Francisco, Mark Twain in San Francisco. At this point in BUMMER's life, BUMMER's sad. He lost his best friend. He had gone around the city, but he was getting old. He was not the young dog he used to be. I didn't want the story to end with the sadness, the disconsolate, the bummer of a life that BUMMER had at this point. He had lost his best friend. He was very sad. And newspaper articles started saying how they would see BUMMER now, and he was just kind of creeping along. He had a wobble. It was kind of a wobble. He would just kind of wobble along. And he was a sad dog. He was not the same peppy dog in some ways. And they would remark how, Mark Twain even wrote that they tried to give him a little puppy to be a replacement dog for Laz, but it was just a puppy. You know, BUMMER was an old guy. He didn't have time for a little dog who was full of energy and wanted to run around. I'm an old dog. They never met. They didn't work. So Mark Twain wrote a little bit about how, BUMMER has a dog, but it's not going to be the same. And that's true. It never was quite the same. Well, I didn't want my dog story to end in a sad note. So I said, my mom had given me this one book here about Mark Twain in San Francisco. And there happened to be a trip that Mark Twain took, a real story. He did go on a trip to this place called the Cliff House, which was perfect, because one of the things I wanted to do in writing my kind of overview about San Francisco during that time period was there's San Francisco and there's San Francisco. There was a lot of other areas of interest in San Francisco, and one was something called the outside lands of San Francisco. The outside lands at that time being where what they call the Sunset District of San Francisco, which is where San Francisco State is, where all of the Golden Gate Park and all of that, that's all the outside lands. It's before the downtown, there's kind of a neglected part of the city at the time, in the 1860s. I said, well, I should have something in there. Now, fortunately, in this story, there's an article about a trip that Mark Twain took with his stockbroker, and it was the exact time that Lazarus had died and BUMMER was feeling depressed and down. I said, wouldn't it be interesting if I could put him on that trip with Mark Twain, that Mark Twain took with his stockbroker to the Cliff House. Now, the Cliff House, if any of you know, it's a really famous building in San Francisco now. Obviously, unfortunately, just this last year, about 2 years maybe now, was torn down, doesn't exist anymore. But for years and years and years, the Cliff House was one of the northwestern part of San Francisco. Okay, very famous establishment, been there forever, and now it's a gift shop or something. I don't know what's that. But when I was growing up, the Cliff House was a big deal. You'd still go out there and get yourself an Irish coffee or something. But back in 1860, back in the days when Lazarus was gone and BUMMER was feeling sad, Mark Twain took this trip. And he went early in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning they got up to get the early ride out there. Because at the time, the only way to get to the Cliff House used to be a small trail that people could only hike there or take horses to, but you couldn't take wagons to. Well, back in late 1863 or so, they found a route that would a wagon route was created so you could take wagons to the Cliff House. And that's the adventure that the stockbroker takes Mark Twain on. And that's the one that BUMMER kind of bums a ride, I guess, to go with Mark Twain. They passed the Fort Point, which if you're familiar with San Francisco, this is still in San Francisco. Fort Point is where the Golden Gate Bridge ends. So they get their first view at Golden Gate Bridge area before the bridge, where the Fort Point was there. And this was an important fort. All kinds of armory were there, artillery and all. They never really used it except for parades, pretty much, or to make a big show, but they were there. They didn't really, the fort was always there, but they got to see this, and Bummer was able to see what that ocean was that he had heard about. He had seen all the ships that came into the bay, but where did they come from? Well, now he understood there's an ocean that connects it, and it's connected by this golden gate, this gateway from one area to another, from the bay to the ocean. They get to the Cliff House, and this is Cliff House 1863, and that's approximately where they would have been. There's a horse and carriage, and this is the Cliff House, and you see these rocks out here? Well, that's what we call Seal Rock. This is where Bummer gets to meet the sea lions of Seal Rock, and they kind of exchange barking. He hears the barkings of the sea lions. He barks back at them and blah, and they have a good time. Bummer has a really good time meeting the sea lions and also playing in the waves and splashing around, looking at the seagulls. It's the first good day he has since the passing of his dog friend. So he ends up with a happy day, and that's kind of how the story kind of ends for Bummer. He comes back and says, oh, what a day, what a great day of memories I had this day. I'm going to come back to you tomorrow. He talks to the bay waters. I'll come back to you tomorrow. And he likes the seagulls and watches the play. I'll be back tomorrow to think some more about what happened in my life. I'll be back tomorrow. Unfortunately, he never makes it back the next day. Unfortunately, poor Bummer is, since has always had a problem with drunks. A drunk named Ripley kicks him down the stairs. He doesn't recover. He stays. He's beaten so badly, he goes back, they drag him back to Martin's saloon, and the Martin saloon people take care of him for a while. Doesn't last for too much longer after that, and he passes away, he dies as a result of the wounds. They capture the guy, all the people were really mad. They said, what, well, this guy, because the police captured the guy right away, this drunk, and when he gets to jail, this guy pops, he says, you killed our Bummer, and he pops him right in the smeller. He hits him right in the smeller. He hits, I'm going to hit you right in the smeller. And he hits him right in the smeller. I couldn't remember what the smeller was because he knows. He hits him right in the nose, his cellmate. So he was mad. The people in San Francisco were mad. But unfortunately, Bummer died as a result of a drunk. So our friend Edward Jump, our sketch artist of San Francisco, writes of the demise of Bummer and Lazarus, with Bummer up in heaven, or Lazarus up in heaven, Bummer about to meet his friend once more, and now the mice, the mice and the rats, I don't know why they're praying or they're just saying, yay, we can go back into the city again. I don't know. But anyway, Edward Jump, that's his portrayal of them. There was a eulogy that Mark Twain had written about Bummer and Lazarus, and it's in the book, and as well as some other comments that were made about our friends Bummer and Lazarus. One of the things that Mark Twain had said is, the city will soon forget. No one will ever remember Bummer. He'll just be a part. He should have died earlier, is really what Mark Twain said. He should have died when Lazarus died, when he was in his prime, instead of this measly old dog. He kind of said, the city will forget about him. As eulogies go, that's not a good one to have, because you want to be remembered, right? I don't know. But poor Bummer didn't get that kind of eulogy from Mark Twain, but he did acknowledge him with a long eulogy. But the city did not forget him. Mark Twain was wrong. There's this plaque to these Bummer and Lazarus that's at the base of the Pyramid building. Our Trans-America building, at the base of there is a plaque. That plaque you saw, that's dedicated, that remembers our friend Bummer. I've never been able to see the plaque every time I've gone there. It's in a little parkette that's kind of closed off at night, and I always go there at night. The one time I went there at night, I wasn't able to see him, but I did see a full moon that time when I went with my little cell phone there, and I took a picture of the Trans-America building with that full moon, thinking that there's Bummer, he's up there shining. San Francisco still remembers him. He's still there. He's still part of us. And that's my story of Bummer. I did a pretty good job of being close to COVID. I'm so sorry. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So, of your PowerPoint, how many of the pictures that you showed, like the Edward Jump stuff, made it into the book?
Every one of them. Every one of those is actually from the book. So, good question. Any other questions about how this came to be, or anything about Bummer, or any? Well, I appreciate your time and listening. Yes.
Well, I mean, this is kind of a little off, but did you use the dog being the voice of the novel, Yard Racing in the Rain, and then the entire Chet and Bernie series? Did any of those influence you in how to present a dog as the narrator of a novel?
The answer is no.
Okay.
I purposely did not want to read any other books about Bummer. First off, there's a lot of things about Bummer that I didn't want to read. I didn't want to read any books that had done a similar type thing, because I wanted to be fresh from me, without being influenced by how other people might have approached it, and maybe even presented information about Bummer. Because there's a lot of Bummer, as I found out, there's lots of books about Bummer. I just wanted to give it how I would feel if I were him. So when you read the book, it's done as if he's speaking. It's how he was feeling. So it's not from like literally what the journalists were saying per se. It's how I would have felt if I were Bummer, the dog, and what his impressions would have been.
So, I asked you before you started, are these books available in the library? If so, how does one find
Yes,
it?
well, a couple of things. One, you could buy one of these books right here. I've got a few books here for sale. If you're interested in buying a book, the library actually has, I gave 4 copies to the library. They are floating around the library. They're going to be in the system right now. I think they just put them in yesterday. So the answer is yes, you can check them out if you'd like. I think it's a good book to have, just because it's a fun read. It's not a long read. I think you could read it in the afternoon at the beach. And again, I purposely did it so that it would not be a heavy, arduous academic approach, so much as a fun, light read that you might find enjoyable and get some history and maybe inspire you to read more about history.
I'm sorry, Ed, one of the Lander, I didn't quite catch that when he went back east after 1861. Did he join the Confederate Army? Or?
Oh, no, good question. No, he was Union. He was a Union man.
Okay. I
Good question. No, he was a big-time Union man. And yeah, he had, all of these people, if you look in Edward Jump even, our illustrator, he had an interesting life. They all just were in San Francisco for that one moment in time. All of these people were in San Francisco. Edward Jump, Mark Twain, General Lander, they were all in there at one time. And poof, the Civil War happens, people go, Mark Twain finds his fame and fortune elsewhere, writing about Connecticut Yankees and things like that. But yeah,
Didn't they just complete the rail line, a transcontinental rail line, about 1865?
1869 or so, yeah. So it's a little bit later, but yeah, there's a little bit later, but Lander was important in developing where is this route going to go. That's why the fact that this dog was a part of that event of history is amazing. The fact that he met Emperor Norton, who again in San Francisco lore, that knowing him alone and that he's in those portraits, that was really amazing. So these are very special. He was a special dog, and the things he experienced were really remarkable. So, yes.
So, you've written other books as well. How do you describe your process about doing this that's different than what you've put together before?
Well, you've written a book. I've written a few things before. The things I've written, the one thing was a 1918 report that I did on the pandemic of when it hit the South Bay schools, 1918. The Douglas, you've seen the book. It's about this thick, and Douglas has helped me kind of go through this thing. It's that took a long time. Basically, the pandemic helped a lot. I had a lot of time on my hand with nothing to do, with a computer, a database from our electronic resources, and an interest in wondering. A lot of scrap paper, a lot of the Bummer book itself. If you kind of just want to see how this looks, this is the Bummer book. It's been through a few miles. It's you'll see there's Pisco Punch. There's articles, there are full text articles about Lander that you can find
on open access newspaper articles and things that you can get. So yeah, I basically get all my notes together, scratch papers, little bits and pieces from each thing, and then you kind of form it the way you want it to be. In the case of BUMMER, again, my intent was as history teacher, okay? I was trying to revert to what would someone who's not necessarily a historian, but might be interested in hearing about history without an overly academic approach. Just a glimpse into the Cobweb Palace. Wow, what a place. Maybe go in there and try and learn more about that. Lander, what an interesting guy. And really, if you read about more, there's lots on Lander. If you read more and more about some of these characters, you'll find there's lots of history out there. Lots of the things that we think we're inventing, or times have never been as bad as they are now. Guess what? They've been pretty bad. You think San Francisco's bad now? You should have seen the Barbary Coast back in the day, you know. People don't get Shanghai much, but things like that, you know, commonplace. One of the people I gave away lots of my books over the time. One of the books that I gave away is a person saying, you know, that reminded me, you know, my relative was Shanghai. Did you know that? I go, no, I didn't know that. So these are real life things that, you know, that did happen. You know, things were bad. People aren't Shanghai too much now, but those things do happen. And, you know, as bad as life may seem, it'll get better. So we can only hope, because there's a moon out there shining down on us. So, yes, ma'am.
What did your mom think of the book? She was your inspiration.
She's so happy.
Yeah.
She's so happy.
Oh,
Can't be better.
I was thinking there might be another bummer out there right now in San Francisco.
There are bummers everywhere. You know, well, one of the things, really, messages I wanted here is kind of a reminder of how we have to be good to our pets. You know, we kick around dogs sometimes, not we, but people do. People kick dogs. People are mean to dogs. People, you know, you can look at the TV. They have those sad commercials that you see on TV where that's very sad music going on, the dogs in the cage, and the abuse that we have animals today. The homeless today, the stray dogs of today, they are really treated mean. They're not always treated nice. So I kind of wrote this with the intent of remembering those sad events that we put on dogs. Dogs and pets are not always cared for. SPCA, at one point I wanted this to go to the SPCA, and I wanted to go up in that angle of, hey, SPCA, use this and make some money. And, you know, if and when I go up, I'm on to my bummer place up in heaven. You know, I'd like any proceeds from this book to go right to the SPCA.
Silent auction.
Yeah. Well, that would be my thing, you know. I would send out any proceeds I get from this dog book, eventually go to SPCA. Because I think that's one of the ultimate messages of this, is how sad we are and how we mistreat animals. And Lord knows Bummer was mistreated. Not only when he was kicked down the stairs, but even before, when he was just a mangy dog and an old dog, and he was literally kicked and spit on and treated like he was no longer worthwhile, because they didn't remember him as the King Ratter. He was just another dog, and he was mistreated. So one of the things I wanted to hopefully inject in this is kind of a sense of be good to your animals and be good to yourselves. So that's kind of part of that. Any other questions? Well, I thank you all for coming in today. I really appreciate it. I have some bookmarks over there. By the way, the book is available on Amazon. We have some copies here if you want. They're available for $15. I think most of the people here already have a copy of the book. But if you'd like to buy another one, or give one to your friends and relatives, please, I'd be glad to autograph a couple of books for you, or a book or so. And give it to your friends, your relatives, especially young readers. I want to encourage them to read and find out more about history. I thank you once again and appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Mama,